Hello, my name is Len, and this is my buddy Chris, and we're going to talk a little bit today about a vanished people, a mystery about people who lived here at one time, and now their culture is gone. This, where Chris and I are standing, is the Sonoran Desert. It's hot and it's dry. Think about what it would be like to live here every day of your life, to get up every morning and have to be out here in the sunshine, stay outside all day, go to sleep at night, wake up the next morning and be here, and it's your whole life. There aren't any stores, okay? There aren't any video games. There aren't any basketball courts. So how do you stay alive? How do you feed yourself, and how do you live? Well, if you remember our last segment, we talked about the archaic people who lived here between 7,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago. And they wandered this desert in search of food and in search of animals that they could hunt and kill and eat, like deer, for example, or antelope, or in some cases, rats, rabbits, and mice. Because they traveled and searched for food, they would gather things like these seeds from a local tree, and they would eat the seeds. And they would carry these seeds in baskets because they were nomadic. Isn't that a cool word? Nomadic. What does it mean? It means that they wandered around a lot, that they didn't stay in one place very long. And because of that, they liked baskets. Because if you're walking through the desert and you drop a basket, what happens? Does the basket break? No, stays in one piece. But if you had a pot made of clay and you dropped it, whoa! What do you think would happen if it hit the ground? We'll tell you a little more about why this is important and what we learn when pots hit the ground and they break. And now, my friend Chris will tell you a little bit about the Hohokam.
Hi everybody. Continuing our story, about 2,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherer archaics that Len just described to you began to disappear. We didn't see any evidence of their culture. But what did arise was another culture, and we call them today the Hohokam. The Hohokam, or the word Hohokam, is a Native American word, and it means those who have gone, because it describes the fact that it was a mystery even to some of the Native Americans as to what happened to the Hohokam. The Hohokam were different than the hunter-gatherers. They were farmers, and because there is not much reliable rainfall in the desert, they couldn't count on the crops that they wanted to grow being able to survive. So they began to adapt their environment to take advantage of what was there and grow the things that they wanted to. So as farmers, what they would do is they would locate themselves near rivers, and they would create what are called canals. And a canal, as you probably know, is just a very long ditch. And those long ditches would connect the water in the nearby river to the fields that they wanted to irrigate. And they were irrigating to grow, in addition to the local plants, they began to cultivate corn, beans, and squash. These were the crops that came from South America and were really the staples of life for the Hohokam and for later tribes of Native American. Because the Hohokam stayed in one place, they were able to make more permanent houses. Those houses actually became villages where large numbers of people lived together, and that's something that the hunter-gatherers did not do. Those homes that they created were made of adobe. I'm holding a piece of adobe in my hand here, and adobe is really just natural materials. It's clay and water mixed with plant material from the area. And if you see here, you can see the plants in the areas that are worn away from the clay, and the plant material serves to hold it together and give it some strength. So this is what their homes were made from, and it really did create a different lifestyle for the Hohokam compared to those who had come before them. The problems that the local culture inherited or was inherent in their environment was the weather. Even though they were very good at farming and creating canals, they still had to depend on the reliable rainfall to feed the rivers so that they got the water that they needed. And sometimes that water did not come for several years, and when rain does not fall for several years, it's called a drought. And a drought simply means a period of time when rainfall is very much below average. Another problem was the exact opposite of that. On occasion, like during a monsoon or heavy winter rain, they'd get too much water, and that water would create floods, and those floods would turn around and destroy, in some cases, their canals. It would flood their fields, and it would ruin their crops that way. The other danger to having too much water is that, as I mentioned, this is adobe, which is mud, and water will deteriorate that if there's too much of it for too long a time. So there are cases where a giant flood would come through and greatly damage the villages that they had built, and they would essentially have to start over to rebuild their houses.
Hi, I've just joined my buddy Chris for a commercial brought to you by Pots and Baskets. If you remember, Chris talked about this particular piece of clay and plant material, which is called adobe. Well, it's made of, what is it made of, Chris?
It's made of clay, water, and natural plant material.
Pots are made of clay, baskets are made of natural material. So this commercial is brought to you by Pots, Baskets, and the McDowell Sonoran Conservancy. And by the way, next, Chris is going to talk to you about something really exciting, garbage. Chris and I are on a hill in the middle of the desert, and this is not an ordinary hill. This hill has some stuff on it that's very interesting, and Chris is going to talk about it in just a minute. But before he does, it's important for us to tell you that the Hohokam people, the Hohokam culture, went away. It disappeared mysteriously about the time that Columbus sailed from Europe to North America, around 1450, 1470 AD. The culture that was here, the farms, the irrigation ditches, the buildings, everything seemed to stop. There may be some reasons why, but no one knows the actual reason. Some of the reasons may be drought. Remember, Chris talked about drought. It was too dry, not enough rain. It may have been too much rain. It may have been that ecologically they put too much water on the land, and therefore the plants would not grow efficiently, and so they couldn't raise the crops they needed for the food to eat. They may have had other people come in who conquered them and overturned their culture. They may have had sickness and epidemics. We don't know the reason why they disappeared, and maybe they didn't. Maybe it's just that their culture changed and looks different today than it did a long time ago. But one thing is true about all people, and that is when they disappear, they still leave things behind that tell us about how they lived.
And those things include Len's favorite subject, which is garbage. As he mentioned, he and I are standing here on a little hill in the desert, and if you get out to the desert, you know there aren't very many hills in a flat desert, but this one is here for a special reason. The archaeologists call it a midden, and it is really one big garbage pile. Now, if that sounds surprising, it's important to remember that archaeologists learn a lot from garbage. Now, all this in front of me here, were found right here on this midden. And this particular one looks like garbage that you're probably familiar with. This is an old can that somebody has discarded and left out here probably several years ago, but it was probably 1,000 years after the other items that are in front of me here were left. And I want to show you these a little bit because I think they tell us a lot about the Hohokam culture. First of all, I'll pick these up and show you there are several pieces of pottery. And these pottery pieces have a fancy name for archaeologists. They're called sherds, pottery sherds. A shard of glass, and this is a sherd of pottery. So this tells us that there were quite a bit of discarded pottery included in this midden. Also, we find pieces of stone, and what makes these special is that you can see where they're chipped. That means that they were worked from a larger piece of stone and shaped into a tool of some sort, and that tool either broke during the creation of it or it broke when they used it and they tossed it here in the midden, thus the garbage pile. A couple other things to look at here in front of me. What we have in here are a duo of two items that are very important to the Hohokam. They're a mano and a matate. This is the mano. Now this is just a piece of one, but this is like a grinding stone. And the matate was a trough, and it was a piece of stone, in this case made out of lava, that served as the grinder. So this tells us that the Hohokam had grain and corn and other items that they wanted to grind. And this grinding happened very easily with these tools. They would take the mano and they would put the grain on the matate, and again there's pieces missing here, but you can see if they worked it like this, it would serve as a grater or a grinder, and they could get rid of the parts that they didn't want, and they would be left over with the flour that they could use to make food for their families. Well, I'm Chris, and we're going to be signing off. We want to thank you very much for joining us in this discussion of the early inhabitants of the Sonoran Desert. If you want to learn more, following our video, you'll find some references for other places where you can go to get information on the archaic people as well as the Hohokam. I'll turn it back to Len now.
Hi, I'm Len. Like Chris, I'm just happy you've joined us for this episode. Please join us for our next episode when we're going to be talking about Native American tribes that lived in this desert. Thank you.